Chapter 86 in the Established in the Faith book is entitled Bible Book Summarised, and this is expanded in larger format in Understanding Topics book, chapters 613 to 636. Now, each book of the Bible is summarised here in a brief manner. First book of the Bible is Genesis, meaning beginnings. It describes the beginning of earth that God created, beginning of plant life, animal life, human life, beginning of marriage, entry of sin into the world, beginning of nations, beginning of Israel, beginning of laws, and beginning of the Bible. We see four parts to the book of Genesis. There is creation, chapters 1 and 2. Then secondly, there is the fall described, redemption described, and Cain killing Abel, and Seth replacing Abel in chapters 3 to 5. The third part we see describing Noah's flood of chapters 6 to 11, and the fourth part is Abraham, Isaac, Jacob through to Joseph, chapters 12 to 50. The second book of the Bible is called Exodus, meaning coming out of Egypt. God appears to Moses to lead Israel out of Egypt in chapters 1 to 4. We see redemption by blood sacrifice of the lamb, blood shed on the doorpost and lintel, chapters 11 to 13. We see Pharaoh's army being destroyed in the Red Sea, chapters 14 and 15, as they pursue Israel and seek to kill the Israelites. Then God gives the Mosaic covenant, the laws, the sacrifices, and the tabernacle in chapters 15 to 40. The third book of the Bible is called Leviticus, and this describes holiness in chapter 19 verse 2. It describes worship, and it describes fellowship with God. Several parts to it are, first of all, it describes the burnt offerings, the meal offerings, the peace offerings, the sin offering, the trespass offering in chapters 1 to 7. Secondly, Leviticus describes consecration of the priests in chapters 8 and 9. Thirdly, it describes food, the right food to eat in chapter 11, childbirth, chapter 12, laws of leprosy being isolated outside the camp, chapters 13 to 15, and the Day of Atonement, chapter 16, the sacrifice laws, chapter 17, laws against fornication, chapter 18, other laws, chapters 19 to 22, 7 feasts of Jehovah in chapter 23, depicting the 7 main events of history, and then blasphemy laws, sabbatical laws, and jubilee year, and the poverty laws on poverty, and laws against idol worshipping, chapters 24 and 25. Then there's blessings, and then there's 5 chastenings, and then there's a dispersion in chapter 26, if and when Israel rebelled against God. Then it talks about vows, firstlings, and dedicated things in chapter 27. The fourth book of the Bible is called Numbers, and this talks about the 40-year wilderness wanderings after Israel leaves Kadesh Barnea in their rebellion, and there's a service and the walking with God. And then there is, the first part is the order of the host, chapters 1 to 10. Secondly is from Sinai to Kadesh Barnea, chapters 11 to 19. Thirdly, we see the wilderness wanderings, chapters 20 to 33. And then there is counsel given in chapters 34 to 36. The fifth book of the Bible is Deuteronomy, meaning second law, and this is described in chapter 11, 26 to 28. We see the 40-year wandering history in chapters 1, 2 and 3. We see the laws that were given, chapters 4 to 11, instructions and predictions in chapters 12 to 30, prophecies in chapter 28 to 30, counsels to priests and Joshua, chapter 31. There's a song in chapter 32, blessings in chapter 33, and the death of Moses in chapter 34. Then the sixth book of the Bible is Joshua, which describes the conquest of Canaan in chapters 1 to 12, the land being partitioned into the 12 tribes in chapters 13 to 21, discord in chapter 22, the last council and death of Joshua in chapters 23 and 24. The seventh book of the Bible is called Judges. Key verse is chapter 17 verse 6, describes Israel's sin. 7 apostasies, 7 servitudes, and 7 deliverances. The 13 judges that God gave Israel are Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar in chapter 3, Barak and Deborah and Gideon in chapters 6 to 8, Tola and Jair chapter 10, Jephthah chapter 11, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon chapter 12, and Samson chapters 13 to 16. The 8th book of the Bible is called Ruth. Key verse is chapters 1 verse 16 to 21. It describes the dangers of backsliding. Ruth deciding in Moab chapter 1, Ruth serving in chapter 2, Ruth resting in chapter 3, Ruth rewarded in chapter 4. The 9th book of the Bible is called 1 Samuel, and this is describing Samuel's life from his birth until Eli's death in chapters 1 to 4, the lost ark up to the king, chapter 5 to 8, King Saul to David's call, chapters 9 to 15, to Saul dying, chapters 16 to 31. And we see 4 parts to the book of 1 Samuel. Number 1, Samuel's birth to death of Eli in chapters 1 to 4. Number 2, the ark captured to the demand for a king, chapters 5 to 8. Number 3, Saul crowned up to the call of David, chapters 9 to 15. And the 4th part is the call of David to Saul's death, chapters 16 to 31. And there's the mention of David killing Goliath, the Philistine. The 10th book of the Bible is called 2 Samuel. Here, King David restores order to Israel, and there's 4 sections here. Number 1 is Saul's death to David being anointed as king of Judah in chapter 1. Section number 2 is David anointed as king of Israel, chapters 2 to 5. 3rd section, David conquers Jerusalem up until Absalom's rebellion in chapters 6 to 14. And the 4th section is Absalom's rebellion to David buying the temple site, chapters 15 to 24. And this covers a 38-year period. The 11th book of the Bible is called 1 Kings. And this is broken up into 7 sections. The first section is Adonijah's rebellion up until David's death, chapters 1 and 2. Second section is Solomon's accession to the throne up to the temple dedication, chapter 2, and then section 3, Davidic covenant to Solomon's death, chapters 9 to 11. The 4th section is the kingdom division to the death of Rehoboam, chapters 12 to 14. The 5th section is kingdom division to Ahab's accession in chapters 15 and 16. The 6th section is Ahab's accession to Ahab's death, chapters 16 to 22. The 7th section is Jehoshaphat's accession to Jehoram's accession over Judah and Ahaziah over Samaria, chapter 22, verses 41 to 53. The 12th book of the Bible is called 2 Kings. This describes the history of Israel and Judah up until their captivities. Amos and Hosea prophesied in Israel. Obadiah, Joel, Isaiah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah and Jeremiah prophesied in Judah. It covers a period of 308 years. We see Elijah taken to heaven without dying in chapter 2, Elisha's ministry, chapters 2 to 13, Jehu rules Israel, chapter 9, verse 11 to 10:36. We see Athaliah and Jehoash ruling Judah, 11:1 to 12:21. Jehoahaz and Joash rule Israel, chapter 13. That's the kings of Israel. Now the kings of Judah, Amaziah, in chapter 14, ruled for 29 years. Azariah or Uzziah, chapters 14 and 15, ruled for 52 years. Jotham in chapter 15 ruled for 16 years. Hezekiah in chapters 18 to 20 ruled 29 years. Manasseh in chapter 21 ruled 55 years. Ammon in chapter 21, 19 to 26 ruled 2 years. Josiah, chapter 22 23 ruled 31 years. Jehoahaz in chapter 23 verse 31 ruled 3 months. Eliakim, or also known as Jehoiakim, in chapter 23 verse 34 ruled 11 years. Jehoiachin, chapter 24 verses 6 to 16 ruled 3 months. Mattaniah, also known as Zedekiah, chapter 24 verse 17 to 25:30 ruled 11 years. And then there was the siege of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, and the people of Judah were deported to Babylon in chapter 25. Book number 13 of the Bible is called 1 Chronicles, written 400 BC. It describes the history from Adam to Cyrus, chapters 1 to 9, David's reign, the priesthood being installed, and the temple being constructed, chapters 10 to 29. It covers 400 years. Chapter 14 is called 2 Chronicles. It discusses 427 years of history of the kings of Judah, from Solomon to Zedekiah, and the Babylonian captivity, and Cyrus conquering Babylon in chapter 36. Then the 15th book is called Ezra. It's one of 6 post-captivity books. These are Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And this book of Ezra records the return of some Jews to Israel under Zerubbabel by King Cyrus of Persia's decree to lay the temple foundation in 536 BC. It discusses, number 1, Cyrus's decree of 536 BC up until the temple dedication in 486 BC, chapter 1, verse 1 to 622. The theme is rebuild the temple. And we see there is, number 1, Cyrus's decree, chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. Number 2, returning remnant, chapter 2, 1 to 70. Number 3, the temple being rebuilt, chapters 3 to 6. And then of this section, A, rebuilding opposed by the bad guys, chapter 4, verse 1 to 6:12. Part B, the temple dedicated, chapter 6, verse 16 to 18. Part C, Passover celebrated, chapter 6, 19 to 22. And Esther's events in chapter 4, from 477 to 465 BC. And secondly, we see the second return and Ezra's ministry 60 years later, 457 up to 457 BC, 7 verse 1 to 1044, as well as reform in the land, chapters 9 and 10. The 16th book of the Bible is called Nehemiah, from 445 to 434 BC. The theme is rebuild Jerusalem's wall, gates and city. Firstly, several sections we see here. Number 1, there's the news of the broken wall and the burnt gates, chapters 1, verses 1 to 4, which distresses Nehemiah. Number 2, Nehemiah's prayer to God to rebuild Jerusalem, chapter 1, verse 5 to 11. Number 3, Nehemiah's request to rebuild the city is granted by King Artaxerxes and fulfills Daniel 9:25, starting the 70-week prophecy in 10 p.m. 4th of March 444 BC in chapters 2 verses 1 to 8. The 4th section is Nehemiah returns to rebuild Jerusalem's wall, chapter 2, 9 to 18. Section 5, the 10 gates are rebuilt, chapter 3 verses 1 to 32, in 11:25 in the Understanding or Answers book. And then the 6th section is opposition by ridicule, chapter 4 verses 1 to 3, anger, chapter 6 verses 6 to 9, discouragement, chapter 10, fear, verses 11 to 23, and division, chapters 5 verses 1 to 5. There's craft, chapter 6 verses 1 to 8. There's lying prophets, chapter 6 verses 10 to 14. Section 7, the wall is finished in 52 days, chapter 6 verse 15. Chapter 8, blessings of the completed wall include the law being read, chapter 8, 1 to 8. The Feast of Tabernacles being restored, chapter 8 verses 13 to 18, the prayer of Israel's history, chapter 9 verse 4 to 38, the covenant made, chapter 9 verse 38 to 10:39, 10% of the people live in Jerusalem, chapter 11 verses 1 and 2, sins denounced, chapter 10 verse 30 to 13 verse 9, and the rejoicing in chapter 12 verses 27 to 43. Now we come to book number 17, is the book of Esther. And Esther means star. This book was written between 477 BC and 465 BC, a 12-year period. The theme of the book of Esther is providence is the hand of God in the glove of history. And the different sections we have in this book, 12 different sections. Number 1, the rejection of Queen Vashti by the king of Persia, chapter 1 verses 1 to 22. Section 2, Esther is made queen, chapter 2 verses 1 to 20. Section 3, Mordecai saves the king of Persia's life, chapter 2 21 to 23. Section 4, Mordecai refuses to bow to Haman, who conspires to kill all the Jews in the 12th month of the 12th year, chapter 3 verses 1 to 15. And then section 5, Mordecai asks Esther to save the Jews, chapter 4 verses 1 to 17. Section 6, Esther invites the king and Haman to a banquet, chapter 5 1 to 14. Section 7, the king orders Haman to exalt Mordecai, chapter 6 verses 1 to 14. Section 7, Esther's banquet request is to hang Haman, chapter 7 verses 1 to 10. Section 9, Esther requests the king to reverse Haman's decree. The Jews are saved. Mordecai is exalted in chapters 8 verses 1 to 17. Section 10, Jews kill their enemies, chapter 9 verses 1 to 11. Section 11, Esther's third request to hang Haman's 10 sons is granted, chapter 9 verses 12 to 16. And section 12, the Feast of Purim is instituted on the 14th and 15th day of Adar, chapter 9 verses 17 to 32. And Mordecai becomes second to the king in authority, chapter 10 verse 3. The next book of the Bible, number 18, is the book of Job, written from between 1900 BC to 1700 BC, and we see 12 sections to the book of Job. The first one is Job's place, lived in Uz. He was a man of great piety in chapter 1 verse 1, a man of great prosperity, chapters 2 and 3, or verses 2 and 3, and great posterity, verses 4 and 5. Section 2, Satan accused Job to God. Satan takes his wealth, asking God to take his wealth and claiming that he will curse God, verses 6 to 12. And Job loses his wealth but passes the spiritual test, verses 13 to 22. Section 3, Satan accuses Job to God to take away his health, claiming that Job will curse God, chapter 2 verses 1 to 6. God gives Satan permission to take away Job's health. Job loses his health, but he sins not, in chapter 2 verses 7 to 10. Section 4, Job's three friends arrive, chapter 2, 11 to 13. Section 5, Job wishes he'd never been born, chapter 3, 1 to 10, or he wished he'd died at birth, chapter 3, verse 11 to 26. Section 6, the first speeches, chapters 4 to 14, include Eliphaz, 4 and 5, Job replies, 6 and 7, Bildad's speech, chapter 8, Job's reply, chapters 9 and 10, Zophar's speech, chapter 11, Job's reply, chapters 12 to 14. Section number 7 are the second speeches, chapters 15 to 21. Eliphaz's speech, chapter 15, Job's reply, 16 to 17, Bildad's speech, chapter 18, Job's reply, chapter 19, Zophar's speech, chapter 20, Job's reply, chapter 21. And then section 8, we see the third speeches, chapters 22 to 31, Eliphaz's speech, chapter 22, Job's reply, chapters 23 and 24, Bildad's speech, chapter 25, Job's reply, chapters 26 to 31. And section number 9, we see Elihu's 4 speeches in chapters 32 to 37, Elihu's first speech, chapter 32 and 33, Elihu's second speech, chapter 34, Elihu's third speech, chapter 35, Elihu's fourth speech, chapters 36 and 37. Section number 10 is most interesting, and it discusses God's 2 speeches, chapters 38 verse 1 to 42 verse 6. God speaks and asks Job many questions in chapters 38 verse 1 to 40 verse 2. Job replies in chapter 40 verses 3 to 5. God speaks and asks questions, chapter 40 verses 6 to 41:34, and Job replies, chapter 42 verses 1 to 6. Section number 11, God rebukes Job's friends, chapter 42 verses 7 to 9. Section 11, God restores Job's prosperity and Job's family, chapter 42 verses 10 to 17. The 19th book of the Bible is entitled Psalms. This includes 5 basic sections known as books. Book 1 is Psalm chapters 1 to 41. It's like Genesis. The key word is man. Book number 2 is Psalm 42 to 72. It's like the book of Exodus. The key word is deliverance. Book number 3 is 73 to 89 chapter. It's like the book of Leviticus. The key word is sanctuary. Book number 4, chapters 90 to 106, is like the book of Numbers. The key word is unrest and wanderings. And then that's chapters 90 and 106. Book number 5 is chapters 107 to 150, is like the book of Deuteronomy. The key word is the word of God in chapter 119. The titles of the Psalms, of key Psalms, are number 1, Psalm 1 is the godly man. Creation is the theme of Psalm 8 and 104. The Good Shepherd is the theme of Psalm 22. The Great Shepherd is the theme of Psalm 23. The Chief Shepherd is the key theme of Psalm 24. Unity is the theme of chapter 133. Jerusalem is the theme of chapters 48, 122, 126, 132, 137. Family is a theme of 127 and 128. Security is a theme of 121. The only true God is a theme of 115. Exodus is a theme of 114. Refuge is a theme of 46. The ladder of faith is the theme of 47. Praise is the theme of 103, 148, 150. Old age is the theme of Psalm 71. Death is the theme of Psalm 90. Life is the theme of Psalm 91. Deliverance is the theme of Psalm 31 and 116. House of God is the theme of Psalm 84. The wealth of God is the theme of Psalm 50. The voice of God is the theme of Psalm 29. The word of God is the theme of Psalm 19 and 119. The mercy of God is the theme of Psalm 136. The goodness of God is the theme of Psalm 27 and 107. The omniscience or all-knowingness of God is the theme of 139. Why is the theme of Psalm 42 and 73. The omnipotence or all-powerfulness of God is the theme of Psalm 147. The Davidic covenant is the theme of Psalm 89. The history of Israel is the theme of Psalm 78, 105 and 106. Despair is the theme of Psalm 69 and 88. And then we come to book number 20, is the book of Proverbs. The theme is that there are 2 schools who seek young people's attention: wisdom and foolishness. Wisdom protects in chapter 2 verse 8. Wisdom directs in chapter 3 verse 5 and 6. Wisdom perfects in chapter 4 verse 18. The authors are Solomon, chapters 1 to 24, Hezekiah, chapters 25 to 29, Agur, chapter 30, Lemuel, chapter 31. There are 11 main subjects in the book of Proverbs. A good name, Proverbs 10:7 and 22:1. Youth and discipline, 10:1, 13:1 and 24, 22:6 and 15, 23:13, 14 and 25. Business, chapter 11 verse 1, 15:28, chapter 3 verse 27, chapter 10 verse 3, 4, 26, chapter 7 verse 23, chapter 24 verse 27, 27 verses 23 to 27. Then marriage is another theme, chapter 5, 15 and 18, chapter 11, 22 and 29, chapter 12 verse 4, chapter 14 verse 1. Immorality is another theme, chapter 2 verse 17, chapter 5 verse 4, 11, 12, 13, 21, chapter 6 verse 26, 27, 32, and chapter 7 verse 22 and 23. Evil friends is the theme of chapter 1 verses 10 to 19, chapter 4 verse 17, chapter 23 verse 6 to 8, chapter 27 verse 19. Wisdom is the theme of chapter 1 verse 7 and 9, chapter 2 verse 16, chapter 3 verse 6, 8, 9, 10, 14, 16, 17, 19, 20. Then chapter 4 verse 7, chapter 7 verse 4, chapter 8 verse 35. Self-control is the theme of chapter 16 verse 32 and chapter 25 verse 8 and 28. Avoiding alcohol is the theme of chapter 20 verse 1, chapter 23 verse 29, 32, 33, 34, 35, and chapter 31 verse 5. Friendship is the theme of chapter 17 verse 17, 27 verse 6, 9, 10, 17, and chapter 18 verse 24. Speech, appropriate speech, is the theme of chapter 10 verse 19, 20, and 21. Book number 21 of the Old Testament and in the Bible is called Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes means addressing an assembly. This contains God's record of man's arguments in chapter 1 verse 15, 2, 24, 3 verse 3, 4, 8, 11, 19 and 20, chapter 8, 15 and 9 verse 10, differing from other Bible verses. This is man's arguments, not God's. Solomon sought to find peace and purpose in, number 1, human wisdom in chapter 1 verse 16 to 18, which didn't fully satisfy. Solomon sought to find peace and purpose, number 2, in pleasure, chapter 2 verse 1 to 3, which did not satisfy. He sought to find peace and purpose in alcohol, number 3, in chapter 2 verse 3, which did not satisfy. He sought to find peace and purpose, number 4, in building projects, chapter 2 verse 4, which did not satisfy. He sought to find peace and purpose in, number 5, gardens, chapter 2 verses 4 to 6, which did not fully satisfy. Solomon sought to find peace and purpose in section 6, having servants, in chapter 2 verse 7. He sought to find peace and purpose in number 7, which was sex, as he had 700 wives and 300 concubines, 1 Kings 11 verse 3. He sought to find peace and purpose in wealth, number 8, silver and gold, chapter 2 verses 7 and 8. And number 9, he sought to find peace and purpose in having an internationally well recognised reputation, 1 Kings 10 verses 6 and 7, which did not fully satisfy. He sought to find peace and purpose, number 10, in cattle breeding, chapter 2 verse 7, which did not fully satisfy. He sought to find peace and purpose, number 11, in music, chapter 2 verse 8. Number 12, he sought to find peace and purpose in literature, 1 Kings 4:32. Number 13, he sought to find peace and purpose in trees and animals, 1 Kings 4:33. And number 14, he sought to find peace and purpose in military power, 1 Kings 4:26, which did not satisfy. And then we see book number 22 is the Song of Solomon, written by Solomon in his younger days. It talks about courtship, chapter 1 verse 1 to 3 verse 5, a wedding, chapter 3 verse 6 to 5:1, married life, chapter 5 verse 2 to chapter 8 verse 14. Book number 23, we see Isaiah, book of Isaiah, 760 BC to 698 BC. This describes the Messiah, chapters 1 to 12 and 53. It describes Babylon, chapters 13, 14 and 21. It describes Assyria and the Philistines in chapter 14. It describes Moab in chapter 15 and 16. It describes Damascus in chapter 17. It describes Ethiopia in chapter 18. It describes Egypt in 19 and 20. It describes Edom in Arabia in chapter 21. It describes Tyre in chapter 23. It describes the kingdom in chapters 24 to 27. It describes warnings, gives warnings, chapters 28 to 34, and it describes the siege of Jerusalem, chapters 36 to 39, and other things are discussed in chapters 40 to 66. The 24th book of the Bible is Jeremiah, written over a period from 629 BC to 588 BC. We see the messages to Judah in chapters 1 to 28, messages to the captives, chapter 29, messages to the regarding the regathering in chapter 30 and 33, message in Egypt, chapters 43 to 44, and message about Elam, chapter 49. Then the book number 25 is called Lamentations. Here we see the book of Lamentation rebukes Israel for provoking God in chapter 1, and discusses the punishment of Judah in chapter 2, discusses the prophet's affliction in chapter 3 verses 1 to 19, and gives assurance of the future, chapter 21 to 33. It gives advice in 40 to 41. It talks about people being thirsty and hungry in chapter 4. It talks about the prayer to remember, chapter 5 verse 1, prayer to repent, or command to repent, chapter 5 verse 16, and command to renew in chapter 5 verse 21. Book number 26 is called Ezekiel, and this has several sections, about 7 sections. The first one is the glory of the Lord departs from Jerusalem in chapters 1 to 10. Number 2, it discusses Israel's sins and Ezekiel being taken to Babylon in the second of 3 captivities, 606, 597 and 586 BC, chapters 11 to 33. Third section, ungodly leaders will be judged in chapter 34. Section 4, Palestinians claim the land in chapter 35. Section 5, Israel returns to the land in unbelief, the prophecy of Israel returning to the land in unbelief, chapters 36 and 37, which was fulfilled in 1948. And number 6, Russian and Muslim armies will be defeated when they attack Israel in the future, in chapters 38 and 39. And section 7 is the temple being built in the millennium, chapters 40 to 48. The key verses are chapter 1 verse 26, chapter 2 verse 7 and 10, chapter 3 verse 17, chapter 6 verses 11 and 12, chapter 9 verse 9, chapter 10 verse 20, chapter 11 verses 17 to 20, chapter 12 verse 13, chapter 14 verse 21, chapter 16 verse 21, chapter 20 verse 12, 20, 26, 31, 38, chapter 22 verse 26 to 30, as well as many other important verses. Let us go now to the next book, which is the book number 27, is the book of Daniel. And this we will look at in about 11 sections. Number 1 is Daniel's devotion to God. Daniel was taken into captivity in Babylon, and he remained devoted to God and refused to eat the king's harmful food. Number 2, Daniel interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream, which is a picture of a description of the future world empires. Number 3 is Nebuchadnezzar's golden image. Number 4 is Nebuchadnezzar's tree dream. Number 5 is Daniel explains handwriting to Belshazzar. Chapter 6, Daniel is saved from the lions. Chapter 7 is the 4-beast dream. Chapter 8 is the ram and the he-goat vision. And then chapter 9 is the 70-week prophecy. Chapter 10, the angel visits Daniel. Chapter 11, the Ptolemy and Seleucid War. Antiochus and Antichrist Antiochus is discussed, and then Antichrist, future attacking of Israel, is described. The key verses are chapter 1 verse 8, chapter 2 verse 44 and 47, chapter 3 verse 25, chapter 4 verse 17 and 27, chapter 5 verse 5 and 22, chapter 6 verse 10 and 25 to 27, chapter 7 verses 3 to 9, 13, 14, chapter 8 verse 20 to 22, chapter 9 verse 24 to 27, chapter 11 verses 2 to 4 and 32, and chapter 12 verses 1 to 4 and verse 10. Book number 28 is the book of Hosea, written in 785 BC, about his unfaithful wives, chapters 1 to 3, the sinful people, chapter 4 to chapter 13 verse 8, and Israel's future blessing and glory, chapter 13 verse 9 to 14 verse 9. Book number 29 is Joel, meaning Jehovah is God, written in 800 BC. It describes a plague of insects in chapter 1, the day of the Lord, chapter 2 verse 1 to 3 verse 8, and kingdom blessings, chapter 3 verses 9 to 21. Book number 30 is the book of Amos, written in 787 BC. It discusses judgment on nearby cities, chapter 1 verse 1 to 2, 3, judgment on Judah and Israel, chapters 2 verses 14 to 16. Book number 31 is the book of Obadiah, written in 887 BC. It discusses four main things. Number 1, Edom's destruction, pride being judged in verses 2 to 4, wealth being plundered, verses 5 to 7, people being killed, verses 8 and 9. Section 2 is Edom's crimes, verses 10 to 14. Third section is God judges Israel's enemies, verses 15 and 16. Section 4 is God blesses Israel's people, verses 17 to 21. Book number 32 of the Bible is called Jonah, and it discusses Jonah the prophet being called by God to go to Nineveh. He refuses to go and flees to Nineveh. He flees to Tarshish, and then on the way he's swallowed by a whale, and the whale brings him back and vomits him back on the shore as a response to his repentance. He returns to Nineveh, he preaches to Nineveh, and he succeeds in the people becoming God-fearers and repenting of their wicked ways. And then he's angry in chapter 4 verse 1, and he prays, and God rebukes him. Book number 33 is the book of Micah, written from 740 BC to 690 BC. And we have three main sections in the book of Micah. Number 1, the outward look, contains 3 sermons. A, Samaria will be destroyed, chapter 1 verse 6. Section B, evil planners, in chapter 2. Section C, Israel's sinful leaders and false prophets, chapter 3. Messiah's future kingdom, chapter 4 verses 1 to 8. The 70-year Babylon captivity, chapters 9 and 10. Armageddon, that was chapter 4 verses 9 to 10. Armageddon, chapter 4 verse 11 to 13. Messiah born at Bethlehem, chapter 5 verse 2. Israel scattered in the church age, chapter 5 verse 3. The kingdom age, chapter 5 verse 4 to 15. Jehovah charged Israel with ingratitude, chapter 6 verse 1 to 5. Ignorance, verses 6 to 9. Injustice, chapter 6 verses 10 to 15. Idolatry, chapter 6 verse 16. The second heading is the inward look, chapter 7 verses 1 to 6. Section 3 is the upward look, chapter 7 verse 7 to 20. And God describes himself in chapter 7 verses 18 to 20. Book number 34 in the Bible is called Nahum, who is a prophet. Nahum means comfort, written from 663 BC to 654 BC, after Thebes or No fell in chapter 3 verse 8. It discusses the fall of Nineveh and the comfort of Judah in chapter 1 verse 3, 7 and 8 and chapter 3 verse 1 and 19. The outline of the book of Nahum is, number 1, there's a judgment on Nineveh, chapter 1 verse 1 to 15. Number 2, judgment is described on Nineveh, chapter 2. Section 3 is the result of the judgment, chapter 3. Then Nahum's prophecies of Nineveh. Number 1, Assyrian fortresses will be easily captured, chapter 3 verse 12. Number 2, Nineveh would never be rebuilt, chapter 1 verse 9 and 14. Number 3, Ninevites will make bricks to repair the walls, chapter 3 verse 14. Section 4, gates will be destroyed, chapter 3:13. Section 5, drunk people when killed, chapter 1 verse 10 and 3:11. Section 6, Nineveh will be destroyed by a flood, chapter 1 verse 8 and 2 verse 6 and 8. Number 7, Nineveh will be destroyed by fire, chapter 1 verse 10, 2:13, 3:15. Number 8, Ninevites will be massacred in chapter 3 verse 3. Section number 9, plunder and pillaged in chapter 2 verses 9 and 10. Section 10, Ninevites would try to escape, chapter 2 verse 8. Section 11, the army would flee, chapter 3 verse 17. And number 12, the idols will be destroyed. Then book number 35 of the Bible is called Habakkuk, written from 620 BC to 610 BC, before Babylon's victory at Carchemish in 605 BC. Habakkuk felt overcome by violence, injustice, sin, evil, and wars in chapter 1. He called out to God in chapter 2. God answered him in chapter 3. Habakkuk's complaints turned to confidence. His fear turned to faith. His burdens turned to blessings. The key verses are chapter 1, verse 2, 12 and 13, chapter 2, verse 2, 4, 8, 14, 15, chapter 3, verse 2 and 17 to 19. Faith is the victory that overcomes the world. 1 John 5, 4 is a theme. Book number 36 of the Bible is called Zephaniah, where he wrote from 625 BC to 610 BC, and Zephaniah means Jehovah protects. He was a great-great-grandson of King Hezekiah. He was kin of Josiah, and there's Hezekiah, then his son Amariah, then Gedaliah, then Cushi, and Zephaniah. They knew Jeremiah in Josiah's reign of revival, 2 Kings 22. The outline of Zephaniah is number 1, soon invasion by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, chapter 1 verses 1 to 2, 3. Section 2, soon judgments on nations, chapter 2, 4 to 15. Section 3, Judah's sins, chapter 3 verses 1 to 7. Section 4, judgment is chapter 3 verse 8 to 13. Section 5, kingdom blessing under Messiah, chapter 3 verses 14 to 20. The outline is judgment on the land, chapter 1 verse 1 to 2, 3. 4 enemies, chapter 2, 4 to 15. 4 leaders, 3, 1 to 7. Blessings on Israel, chapter 3 verses 8 to 20. Book number 37 is called Haggai, means festival. It's written in the rule of Darius Hystaspes, 522 BC to 486 BC, and its theme is to rebuild the temple, and it happened by 515 BC. Cyrus permitted Haggai, Zechariah, governors of Zerubbabel, the high priest Joshua, a total of 49,897 people in Ezra 1, 64 and 65, to return to rebuild the temple, prophesied in 712 BC, in Isaiah 44:28, and fulfilled in 536 BC in Ezra 1, 1 to 4. Bardia, king of Persia, stopped the temple in 522 BC, and he died within the year. Ezra 4, 1 to 24. King Darius I of Persia from 522 BC to 486 BC restarted the temple construction in Ezra chapters 5 and 6. There are 4 messages. Number 1, we should encourage leaders and people to rebuild the temple, chapter 1. Number 2, the glory of the third temple in the 1,000 years will be greater than the others, chapter 2, 1 to 9. And section 3, questions for priests, build and be blessed, verses 10 to 19. And section 4, future destruction of Gentile armies at the Battle of Armageddon, verses 20 to 23. Book number 38 of the Bible is called Zechariah, written from 520 BC to 487 BC. It covers 10 visions described in chapters 1 to 6, 4 messages in chapters 7 and 8, the king rejected in chapter 9, 10 and 11, the king enthroned in chapters 12 to 14. Book number 39, and the last book of the Old Testament, is called Malachi. We see it's broken up into 6 sections. Number 1, respond to God's love, chapter 1 verses 1 to 5. Section 2, honour God, chapter 1 verse 6 to 2:9. Section 3, be faithful to God, chapter 2 verse 10 to 16. Chapter 4, trust in God, chapter 2 17 to 3:6. Chapter 5, obey God, chapter 3 verse 7 to 12. Chapter 6, fear God, chapter 3 verse 13 to 4:3. And it was written in the year 397 BC. And then we will now shortly look at the New Testament.